And so my hope for the next 90 minutes or so is that we can just be candid with one another. As long as we're respectful and kind, let's talk about the difficult things, and hopefully we'll leave here having learned more and have a deeper understanding of each other. That sound like a plan? Okay, so I'm going to bring up our panelists. They'll get the grand walk down the aisle to their chair. And I don't know, Dennis, I think you're ready to go. I'd like to introduce you to Dennis Caldirola. And he is a well-known auctioneer and executive director of Festa, Italiana, and a former recording artist and radio host. And he's been directing the festival since 1993. You have a lot of energy. Let's welcome him. Dennis. Okay, and then Juliet Cheatle. Let's welcome her up. Juliet, she's a choreographer, dancer, and of the Filipina Performing Arts of Washington State. She's a well-known local and national Filipina activist. Welcome to the stage. All right. And Ramon Isao. He's going to come up now. He's an award-winning author, teacher, screenwriter. He's a recipient of the Artist Trust and Jack Straw Cultural Center Writing Fellowships and the Tim McGinnis Award for Fiction. So Ramon, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Now I know all three of you have done so much more than what I could mention in those 2 sentences, which I probably botched in some cases, so please forgive me. So why don't we start off by just you sharing with everyone how you're involved in your culture sharing or their celebration. So Ramon, you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
On this panel, I'm probably the least kind of integrally involved in sort of organizing cultural ceremonies. I mostly take part as a civilian, but I do have 2 primary, my background is split into 2 primary ethnicities. They are Japanese and El Salvadorian. And those 2 ethnicities are very different, obviously. And so sometimes it can be kind of challenging to sort of find my way into that. So I'm here to partially talk about that. Yeah.
All right, Juliet.
When I came to the United States here in Seattle or in Washington State, I got involved because my 2 children, my 2 kids are biracial. I want them to be reconnected with their culture. That's how I get involved. I started with my 2 kids, and I had them dance when they were, I think, 4 and 7 years old. I have them dance in a picnic, and then people were looking at them. And then all the parents come to me and said, "Oh, that's a good idea. Can you teach my kids too?" So that's how I started.
Wow. That's pretty cool. Great story.
You know, it's interesting. Already we've taken a left turn, and the whole subject of biraciality suddenly came on the table.
It was inevitable.
So for the record, I'm here today representing the Italian Festival at Seattle Center, but my first name is Dennis, so that might give you a clue. My mother was Irish, still is, I suppose, and my dad was from Italy. So I too represent 2, if not races, then certainly 2 different cultures. That's for sure.
Okay.
Okay.
And tell us how. And so.
Thank you. Yes. Back to the topic. I used to play rock and roll here in the Seattle area, and eventually became a disc jockey and a radio DJ, and started doing a lot of public speaking as a result of all of that. So when the Italian Festival was organized in 1988, the community came to me and asked me to be the stage MC, which I did for 3 years. Then I went off to Spain, worked at Expo 92 as the entertainment director for the Canadian Pavilion, and when I came back, the same folks from Festa Italiana came to me and said, "We want you to be the director of this little show." And that was 25 years ago.
And here you are.
And here I am.
Okay. And how do you define culture?
You know, I've been thinking about that because it's a word that has many different applications and meanings considering the circumstances. And I suppose the first one that comes to mind, at least in terms of the English language, When we say someone is cultured or a person of culture, that would indicate an interest in the fine arts, and probably including literature as well, drama as well. But when we talk in terms of societies in an anthropological way, Margaret Mead kind of way, the culture of a society is really every aspect of it. How they dress, how they eat, how they find food, how they communicate, how they marry or get involved with one another, and so on and so forth. That all is a culture. And I think that may be primarily what we share and work with when we talk about, you know, the Tet Festival or the Irish Festival. We're really looking at all aspects of that particular culture's life, history.
Okay. What about you guys, Ramon or Juliet? Did you want to share anything additional to that about culture?
How do I define culture? Like you said, I really didn't, you know, like think about it. But for me, culture is a shared belief by a certain community or a society. When I say shared, they shared a particular or the same tradition, values, their habits, or maybe their morals. And the culture, with this culture, a group of people or a society use this culture to deal and cope with one another, and to cope, you know, the world where they live. That's how I define culture.
I'm primarily a writer, so I tend to have to write things down in order to be able to then say them out loud and reproduce them. I apologize in advance, but I think of culture as the current draft of the story, like a particular group of people tells about themselves, you know, and what is being advanced in that current draft in terms of like our collective stories, our collective identity, and what we believe in, and where the self kind of melts away into something larger that pierces deeply, deeply into history. So that's what I think of as culture. But I also have to say, it is also something I don't think about because it's also largely intangible and invisible and has to be very carefully scrutinized, I think, to be comprehended. So yeah, but that's how I think of culture.
That's one of those things I had to write down. I'm like, the self melts away into something bigger. That was pretty profound. I like that. Very nice. So here we're celebrating, 20 years of doing these festivals at Seattle Center. And I know when I first moved to Seattle and I would hear about the various events, I didn't know it was connected to things that happened throughout the year. I just said, oh, I can take my children and they can be exposed to someone else who's different than them or has a different culture than them. What is the significance of having these celebrations? I'd like to know what they've meant over the years, but more importantly, how relevant is it today? I mean, we're in a situation in which people are on Facebook. They can connect all kinds of different ways. Supposedly, we're more connected. Are these still relevant, and how have they been relevant over time? And whoever wants to kick things off.
I'll launch into
Okay.
it. Not only speaking from my own experience, but also observing the other festivals at Seattle Center for all these years. They usually start out as an internal celebration among the community itself. And this is particularly observable in more recent immigrant communities where, for example, they all still speak a different language than English. And of course, the music is sung in that language and the costumes reflect that background. And then gradually what they begin to learn, again, this is as a community, is that if they invite the outside community in to participate, that they can also educate the rest of us about them, in some cases to dispel stereotypes, in others to just say, hey, look how cool, how fun it is to be involved in our community. And so it becomes a dialogue at that point and a two-faceted purpose for having these events. What do you guys think?
We are talking about why cultural celebration is important.
Yes, why are they important, and how, or do you see them as more relevant today? And I think I'd also be interested in your insights of how they've been important over time, since you've been involved for many years.
Cultural events, with my experience, I think it's very, very important to have it in a community and in a place, because for me, it is a celebration, a gathering where an individual or a group will go and be comfortable sharing what they have, their talents, and then to connect with other cultures. And I was just, when we had the panel during the Northwest Folklife Festival, I always tell people, I said, if it's too expensive to travel to learn another culture, go to a celebration, go to a cultural celebration. There you can meet other people there and share your ideas, connect with them. That's it. And it's fun.
I'd agree.
I think obviously they can be important for different reasons based on what the cultural celebration is specifically, but I think in general, one of the primary values for me is a kind of, especially in the United States and especially in the Pacific Northwest, I think it can be a kind of mass reification and like standard agreement about what we are and why it's important, and that it's not necessarily like other. Do you know what I mean? Like it's something that is, I think oftentimes you can feel in the Pacific Northwest that your culture is other, you know what I mean? Like just by default. And I think a cultural celebration is a great way to kind of remind yourself that it's not. It's just like I said, it's a story of your history, you know. So I think it's got that definite value for sure. And then yeah, absolutely, like it's fun. Yeah, it's so much fun. And I think there's not enough fun in modern life. I really do think that in general. So yeah.
And Ramon, you talked about that feeling like an other, specifically being here. Why is that? And why do you think that is for the Northwest? And then what's your experience has been feeling like another?
Yeah, I grew up in Edmonds. Do you guys know Edmonds? It's like right up there.
Yeah, north.
It's like that way. Yeah, it's like over there.
North.
Yeah, you can throw a rock and hit Edmonds from here. And if you do, throw it hard. I'm just kidding. So I grew up in Edmonds, and it was just it was a really super white community, you know, just predominantly. And I also came up in the 80s. My parents are both immigrants, and I think, and not only they immigrants, but they're immigrants from different countries. So there was kind of the common parlance had to be English in our house, you know, just so we could communicate with each other. And so I think, especially for my parents, they're not here, are they? Yeah, I bless them.
We'll
love my
delete
parents.
this part from the recording.
If you could just cut around
there'll be a
this.
black hole.
So I'll just be like, thank you very much at this point, and it'll be very abrupt. But like, I think, and bless them, I love them to death. I owe them everything, okay? But I think at that time, their strategy was, well, he's an American kid. Let's let him be an American kid, and let's let him kind of assimilate into that thing, you know? And it's weird because I don't really talk about this privately with anyone, let alone publicly. But yeah,
I'm so glad you feel at home.
Yeah, I'm at home. I'm ready. I love you guys. I love you too. Just kidding. Just kidding. Too. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. Yeah. So that to me, I think it was just being made. But the thing is, even if you're like, well, he's an American kid, we'll let him be an American kid. But America has ideas of what you're supposed to be too, based on you not being traditionally American, right? And so oftentimes, you know, when I was a kid, just having to tell my friends when they came over to take their shoes off when they got in my house, which should totally be the default, because I'm sorry, it's disgusting to have your shoes in the house. I just think it's gross, and I think you're gross if you do it. But I think... I'm just kidding. I'm half kidding. But so yeah, basically that's it. So I think you get kind of used to almost kind of thinking of yourself as other without realizing you're doing it for years. like years without you, and then one day you're just kind of like, why do I always do that thing? Why when I go into a convenience store do I always keep my hands at my sides? Like, why do I do that? And I do that because of the convenience store at Fruitdale Village in Edmonds, you know what I mean? So there's little things that you can start tracing back and doing the math on and realizing that you live your life in a kind of guarded, hidden way. And at a ceremonial celebration, at a cultural celebration, I don't have to do that, so that's super gratifying, I think. Does that answer the question?
It did. I think you were sharing your
right?
experiences of your parents wanting you to be an American kid,
Yeah.
and not really embracing who you are, really, or
Right.
the cultural customs. I suppose.
Totally, because they were both super busy, and I'm not complaining about that at all.
Yeah.
It just feels so bad. I love my parents so much.
Can you guys relate to that in any way?
Well, yes, most definitely. Am I hot?
You are hot.
Check, testing, 1, 2, 3. Nope, I got a bad battery is what I've got. You can hear it out there? Oh, I can't hear it up here. Did we lose a monitor? Okay. In my particular case, this is just a historical fluke. My mother had married an Italian prisoner of war here in the United States after the war, and they went back to Italy for 4 years until I came along, and then they re-immigrated to the United States. And so my mother sent me off to the first day of kindergarten in little blue shorts with white socks, and I came back from school mad as hell. My poor mom was sitting out on the stoop waiting for me to come in, and she said, "Honey, how was it?" And I said, "I hate it. I'm never going back." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, first of all, everybody speaks English." Okay? And she said, "Well, that's okay. You know how to speak English. Speak English." I said, "And they all wore blue jeans." And she said, "Well, you have blue jeans. You can wear blue jeans." That's what we called them back then. So she had tried to keep the culture, her new adopted culture, passed on to me, and in fact was the one who taught all of her kids to speak Italian. My dad obviously spoke Italian, but he was more, interested in becoming American, probably similar to you. Though I have to tell you something. My daughter is a 4th grader at Edmonds Elementary. It doesn't look like it did when you were there, let me tell you. And when she goes to College Place for middle school in a couple of years, 76 languages spoken at College Place. Really? So Edmonds has changed dramatically, as you can imagine. But anyhow. So Juliet, you talk a little bit about this. Did you have trouble fitting in, or
Feeling like an other?
No, I never had a, feeling when I came to the U.S. I stayed in I live in other states before. I even live in a very, very small town in Pennsylvania where my ex-husband came from. There was only there was only 2 Filipino, 1 doctor and me, and then there was 1 Chinese doctor. And I always tell people, I said, I came from the Philippines, right? And I came from a tribal group in the Philippines. When I went to school in the city in the Philippines, that's where I felt like I'm a different person. Because the people, they look at me like, "Oh, you're from the Philippines, you're a savage." I felt it there. I never felt it here in the States. And when I chose Washington State to be where I live after living in maybe about 5 different states, I chose to live in Washington State. So my first we went to live in Arlington, early 1990s, in really very, very small town, predominant white. And I did not, even my kids, I asked my kids, is everybody treating you well in school, knowing that, your mother is a Filipina, and they never had a problem? No, I did not. Maybe, I don't know. People always ask me, did you feel discriminated? Or I said, no. I did not feel it at all.
And did you always get recognized as a Filipina, or were you lumped into another group, or how was it for you?
I was recognized as a Filipina. They asked me a question, and I answered them in a nice way. You know, I always think when they ask me a question, I always think of them like they were ignorant. You know, so they're asking this question. So I tell them, okay, this is how we are. This is, you know, this is who we are.
And when you use the word ignorant, because some people will use the word ignorant and it has nothing behind it other than you don't know.
Yes,
and
that's
then
how
some
I
people
use it,
ignorant like you're ignorant. So let me
Yeah.
educate
You know,
It's
okay, if I say ignorant, I don't mean that you're dumb or, you know, like my mother, I can call my mother ignorant. My mother, you know, never maybe finished until third grade. When I bring her to the city, she's like a kid. So that's the way I mean ignorant, because some people here they are more into doing other stuff that they don't have time to learn something else. You know, that's the way I look. I call ignorant.
Right, like you think chocolate milk comes from the brown cow, right?
Yes,
I mean, that's
something,
that.
yes.
No, there
Or
was,
maybe I should use the word naive. Yes.
they both work. You know, and for those of
Yes.
you, there was just a headline that came out yesterday that I guess a lot of Americans thought that chocolate milk came from brown cows. So that was the reference. I just wanted to fill you in. Apparently so. You know, I'll have to go research it to make sure I'm not giving alternative facts or something. But, you know, my motivation for asking you that question as a person who, you know, talks a lot in front of groups, and even if you don't, sometimes you have this fear of saying the wrong thing to people, and you want to ask the question, whether it's someone who wants to touch your hair and ask you about how that is. And I guess there's just this, have you guys sensed that, even outside of your own culture, just, okay, am I going to say the wrong thing? And what's that been like for you? And we'll be able to open this up for questions during the last 45 minutes or so. Why?
I have an experience with that, people touching my skin and touching my hair. Yes. Italy, too. When I went to Italy, the best thing it's really a very good experience. I went to a village in Czechoslovakia. Okay. I rode the bus. I was traveling by myself. And I rode the bus, and I was just getting lost. You know, I want to get lost. So I was traveling. I came into this village, and I rode in the first seat of the bus. And all these people that comes out will just, you know, just touch my skin if it's really real. My color was really touch my, and you know, it was so funny. I feel like, you know, like, and then the way they look at me though is like, it's not like. Their eyes is not like laser eyes. It's just, they were just curious about me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the same thing when I was working in Okinawa, I went to these small islands, the Ryukyus Islands, and then the older Japanese will pull me, you know, at the airport and take picture with me, and you know, like, so it was quite an experience.
Wow. Ramon, did you want to? Okay, you were going to wait.
I was just going to ask her, is there any place you haven't been?
Yes, there's more place I need to go.
Ramon, what were you going to say something to add to that in terms of that? I guess I wonder sometimes when I talk to people, they have a curiosity about another person's culture, but they're afraid to ask because they're going to say something offensive. And I don't know what the answer is to that.
It may be my person. I just ask. Yeah, I do tend to just ask, and so far I've been okay. I haven't. It hasn't backfired, but there might be some circumstances or some conditions under which I wouldn't. But for the most part, I tend to just, if I'm curious about something, I'll ask.
Just go for it.
Yeah, I believe in asking for forgiveness rather than permission. I think for the most part, you know
That gets you far. Yeah.
Or I'll die tomorrow. It's one or the other.
Awesome.
So this kind of brings us around in full circle. A community or a cultural and ethnic festival is a really good way, kind of a Whitman sampler, if you will, to learn about a culture that you might be curious about without having to ask a lot of questions. Just go down, eat some of the food, listen to some of the music, watch some of the dancing or whatever they have. And you can expand your geographical horizons without having to feel awkward about it. That's one of the reasons we put these things on, you know.
How has it been engaging young people? And what are you doing now to get more of them engaged in your celebrations, and what is important to you?
In our case, and I'll just answer this right off the bat, we are struggling with it mightily because the last wave of Italian immigrants to hit the Pacific Northwest prior to the Microsoft hirings in the 1990s was after World War II, the late 40s and 50s. Those people were the people who founded Festa Italiana and belonged to the Italian Club of Seattle and the Sons of Italy, and they united and moved their society, their group ahead in a unified fashion, and now they're all dead. So when we lost that when we lost that generation, we lost our biggest donors, our biggest group of volunteers, and the people who came and had the most to gain by participating and also the most to give in participating. And it's been a challenge the last decade or so when the last of these folks are passing away in their 90s. We're feeling the pinch. And so we're going to other ethnic festivals. One of the reasons we belong to the Festal Coalition is so we can learn from them what they're doing. We desperately need it.
Struggling. Yes, we are struggling. The Filipino community too. Let me talk about the Filipino community I belong to in North, based in Everett. When I joined that, when I came to Washington State and I became a member, the older generation always say they are struggling to have even their children come and celebrate or be a part of that association. So what I did, I think, so I said maybe we should, create some activities that will let them in. Right. Maybe what you're doing is boring. This is for the older people. Do something that will excite the kids. So then I became president. So that's what I've been doing. And I think with my dance group too, I think cultural awareness, teach them, acknowledge them, reconnect them to their roots, where they came from. And then that will make them prouder. It's like I have, when I always tell my dancers, if you watch the Philippines, we came from different race, okay? And I always tell my dancers, I said, where do you find, I talk about the difference of my dance group with other dance group. I said, look at our dance group. You have the chance to wear this different outfit. These outfits are so very, very special. You just don't go in the corner and dance. You have a special group of audience, special people, who watch this. And then you wear this outfit. And so I teach them about what is that outfit they are wearing. You just don't wear that outfit and dance. There's a meaning to it. So you're very, very fortunate to wear that. So that's what I did with my community. Mm-hmm. And I try to partner them with adults and then have them volunteer and then train them to be leaders because they will be the one to take over.
Do you have any examples of someone, a young person you brought in that maybe didn't feel that strong connection to their identity and then how being part of it impacted them?
Yes. I have a lot of people like that in my dance group. Even some of them are even their parents are even both Filipinos. They were raised and born in the Philippines where they came, and then they came here, and then their kids were born here. And they are so busy working, lots of hours of working. I tell the parents, you really need to have a time with your kids. You are the best cultural teacher to to teach tradition to your children. What you teach them, your experience in the Philippines, they will not find that in the library. So I give, when I give research for my dancers, like I said, okay, I want you to learn, I want you to research about this dance, the origin, what it came from. But first thing, you have to interview your parents. Because even some parents will even say, oh, I did not do that in the Philippines. I said, well, you're learning. You learn together.
You know, it's funny, you talk about parents being the best teachers. And has anyone ever seen the show Blackish? There was an episode in which, so there's a thing in the Black community, you may have seen this, where you give another person the head nod. So if you're walking down the street, whether you know them or not, you give the head nod. And so in this particular episode, and he's busy working, to your point, Juliet, the dad's busy working, he's walking with his son at school, his son passes a Black person and doesn't acknowledge him with a head nod. And he's like, what have I been doing? I've been too busy. I haven't exposed my son to our culture. And I find it interesting in Seattle in particular. So if I go to Philadelphia and walk down the street, every Black person will give me a head nod and say hello. And they're not trying to hit on me or get anything from me. They're just saying hello. And I find it interesting in Seattle that that's not the case. It is a very, and I'm not really sure what that's about.
Okay,
But-
I got to ask you this right off the bat.
Okay.
Do they give it to white people?
Do they give it to white
Or
people?
is it a sign?
White people get a smile.
Okay, all right. Because in Italy,
Everybody gets a smile.
In Italy,
Yes, what is it?
everybody gives everybody the head nod and the smile. And they say, buongiorno. You cannot walk down the street and not acknowledge every single person you come across. It's their culture.
Yeah.
But you guys are just apparently acknowledging your uniqueness amongst yourselves, which is fair. That's fine. I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, so does someone want to weigh in on that?
I think particularly for men, African-American men, and the other particular part of that is being in the Northwest. I grew up in Inglewood, California, and came to the Northwest. So coming from Los Angeles, where there are a lot more African-Americans and that many less in Seattle, and then going to the University of Washington, the exposure to what I'm accustomed to in Los Angeles, there are a lot more of us, particularly in Inglewood. And so when I see, and usually it's an unfamiliar face. You don't know the person because you greet them differently if you do know them. But if you see a familiar face or just another African-American man, you just say, what's up? Or you give him a nod, and that's an acknowledgement. I see you, because it's a rarity that I see him, collectively speaking. So that's kind of, just people, faces in here I recognize, and you don't know their names, but it's just an acknowledgement. Okay, I see you, and I'll see, we don't know names, and we may meet another occasion. So it's just because there are fewer of us, and that is kind of a communal kind of deal, that when you see another one, you recognize them, and you don't
Right.
just pass by.
And unless you go to a cultural celebration, there really isn't that gathering place or that place to come together and be part of that community. Steve, you were going to say something.
And I think that there are other cultures that have a sort of a greeting, and sometimes it's language. And so for Black folks, it's the head nod. That's language. And I think I've seen other cultures that have a language that they might say to, like he was saying, I see you. I know we're the same, right? Is that true? And I say that because I think in the Philippine culture, and I don't know exactly, but there's a word or an acknowledgement that I've heard. So.
Juliet's like, I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe I'm which culture
Okay.
it is.
No, but still, point well taken. And I think this gentleman has had his hand up for a bit.
Thank you. The head on thing is very interesting because I know that motorcyclists, I've got a friend who's a motorcyclist. You acknowledge that shared identity.
Yep.
And on the Bainbridge Island, you wave at everybody because that's part of Bainbridge culture. I've heard various folks who are not white talk about not feeling as safe in the Northwest as opposed to like Baltimore or other areas. If the head nod isn't common in the Northwest, is it because, while you want to acknowledge a shared identity, maybe you don't feel as safe calling it out?
Maybe so. Okay, one here and then one there. Yeah.
Actually, I want to get the mic back to the front.
Of course, yeah.
But also, just as someone who's a member of the library's Race and Social Justice Change team, one of the things that I noticed is we were talking about race, identity, and culture in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to encourage the speakers and the audience to keep in mind that in the Pacific Northwest, there were different things that set up barriers for people who could not participate in whiteness. And so when you think about the settling of the Pacific Northwest, the Chinese Exclusion Act, even in, we acknowledged we were on Duwamish land, but Native people were also considered illegal in their own ancestral lands. And so when we talk about cultural difference, I just want to encourage us to be mindful that there's structures of systemic racism in America that may make it highly unlikely that we can have that humane system that you talked about in Italy, although I will say when I visited, that wasn't always the experience that I had. And so thinking about what is it that we can do a yes and, not an either or. How do we have a homogenized existence in America? I don't have an answer for that. But how can we create a space to acknowledge cultural difference as a given that we appreciate and celebrate and understand people might want to relate to their own culture and be part of broader society. So just putting that out there.
Okay, and can we just have one more, and then I'll get us back to the topic there.
Hi, my name's Devin.
Hi,
I'm
Devin.
with the Filipino American National Historical Society. And yeah, we're based in the Central District. I also grew up Central Seattle and also in Edmonds too, so I went to Meadowdale.
Okay.
So I have both
Edmonds.
worlds, Seattle and Edmonds. But I think what's interesting, Angela, when you're saying you don't notice the nod in Seattle, and yeah, when I talk to Black friends who are maybe from California, I have a friend from LA. He'll head nod to somebody Black at my office, and she won't respond, and he'll be like, she didn't wave back at me. But I think one of the things that plays into that, if I think about how we were segregated in Seattle, I'm a Filipino whose family's been here since 1910. So my kids are fifth generation Seattleites. And I think it's because part of why some of the same acknowledgments and practices don't exist with different ethnic groups here might be because of the cloistered nature of how we were here in Seattle. So that our practices fit into a very small micro space. So they didn't need to, those cultural interactions didn't need to be the same as they were in other places in America. And yeah, I mean, if I were to take maybe just the example of Juliet and myself, like I don't associate very well with other Filipinos in the area because I don't speak Tagalog. Like my primary language from 100 years ago is Ilocano, which is not the normal language that Filipinos speak anymore. So I think just the nature of Seattle historically, there's definitely a microculture within its own ethnic groups that may not exactly match other areas in America. And also within that too, I think just this idea that we have to accept being foreign or accept being have this sort of novelty aspect to us by celebrating our culture. I feel like there should be something normal with being both. I shouldn't have to be forced into being either or you have to celebrate your foreignness. And for me, I feel like that's a force of cultural oppression. There's traditional America, like Ramon was bringing up. I don't think there's traditional America. There's always been diversity in America. There's been an oppressive America that told you could not be different or celebrate that manner of yourself. So for me, yeah, I'm really looking forward to a day when your cultural tradition is different and American at the same time. And yeah, I don't have an answer for how that should be. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for your comments. And how we got here, we were talking about engaging young people, and then Juliet was just saying how parents being the best teachers in terms of passing that culture along. And so I don't know, Ramon, if you wanted to add in terms of the topic, or if you just want to kind of veer off this exit with us, or yeah.
Yeah, passing on culture to your it's like marginally louder. Passing on your culture to your kids, especially like I said, I mean, I'm biracial, so it was really tough and may complicate things a little bit. But I think it can be difficult sometimes. I think because another thing that culture is that we haven't really defined is that it is the absolute like reality for an entire group of people in an entire place at an entire time, you know what I mean? And so sometimes it's tough to have to pass on that reality when there seems to be this other reality in place. It's not even necessarily an oppressive reality, it's just what, you know, the majority of people have expected from this particular culture. So I think that's part of the complication of passing it on. I do have a son that resisted speaking Japanese. He's 3/4 Japanese, and he resisted for a really long time. He didn't want to speak Japanese, and then we took him to Japan, and that ended. It just ended. It was over. He was like, "Oh, everybody does that." Okay, God. Oh my God. Why didn't you say so? That would have made this this whole transaction would have been so much easier. But coming here, like, you have to really kind of fight for those spaces. He does go to like Japanese immersion. He went to Japanese immersion preschools. He's going to McDonald International School as a heritage speaker of Japanese. He was like the 5th on the waiting list. Nobody cares. I know. If you're a parent, you know what I'm talking about. Holla to the parents. But so it felt really good to know. It feels very good to me to know that he's going to go to a school where he's going to be able to actually live within his own culture for half of the day, and he won't have to kind of abandon it to walk through those doors. So yeah, the more kind of outlets we have like that, the more opportunities we have to have that difference. That's also not, you know, it's both different but accepted, and that difference is valued as cultural currency. I think that's a great way to do that, but.
Juliet.
Can I say something?
Of course, yes.
It should not be very difficult to pass it to younger generation. Like I said, it's come from your home. It starts home. You don't have to go to a school to learn maybe Ilocano. You look back, go to your parents, and try to connect with other relatives in the home, in the community, in the neighborhood. Because that's what I think. It should always start from home.
For the
Ramon, excuse me, Angela, I'm sorry, but you brought up a very interesting point. You wanted to teach your child about your previous culture, let's call it ancestral culture, how's that, okay? But your folks didn't want to teach you about it. So obviously you began to value that heritage on your own, apparently, and now wanted to pass it along.
Yeah, to be fair, I really feel bad to my parents. I hope that's not them walking out right now. But no, I think there's a few things. First of all, they had never been to America. You know, and they didn't know the kinds of fights that a lot of people have to take, because some people do actually have to fight for that culture. We are a Japanese home. We do speak Japanese. We celebrate all the Japanese holidays.
And they don't wear their shoes in the house.
And we don't, absolutely, you better not. Don't even start with me. I don't even care. If you're here to check the cable, you better have footies. But I think it can still be very difficult, I think, to pass on, especially because we're talking, by the way, because this conversation so far is exclusively talking about me passing on his Japanese heritage. He is also a quarter Salvadorian. Right? Yes. How does that get in? The math is not as easy as you think. It can be tough, especially for my parents who just did not know what America was going to quietly ask me to participate in. You know what I mean? And so I think it can't. I think in some ways, yes, you have your culture in the home, and I think that's the best way to sort of like filter it through. But it gets complicated when you have 3 different cultures in the home sometimes. You know what I mean? And so I think for them, they did what they could. But me now having had a foothold, now I have had the advantage of being able to have spent a generation in this country. Now I have a slightly better idea of how to pass that on. But I'm telling you, the Salvadorian stuff, then I try to slip in Spanish, and he's like, seriously? Dude, there are like so many different words in my head. I'm speaking the wrong language to the wrong people sometimes. Like, let's keep it easy, Dad. Let me play with my Legos, and you go look at your phone.
And speaking of phones and all the distractions that exist today, how do you get the younger generation to understand why it's important? And maybe I'll approach this by saying, why is it important? It's like if you're sitting in a math class and people are looking at the math and they're wondering, okay, how is this going to apply to my life? And you talk about how you want your students, Juliet, to interview their parents and know these particular costumes. Why is that important for them in their life? I mean, is it about strengthening identity? And if so, why is the identity important? Make the case.
Okay. Knowing your culture will direct you to a good future.
Well, that was easy.
Drop the mic.
Okay. Yeah, so you have to. It's like when you know who you are, you never know who you are. You really need to research. There's a lot of Filipinos, younger generation who are born here, and they come to me. I teach at the Seattle U once in a while, and then I also go other states and do workshop and lectures. And if you know who you are and become proud of who your ancestors are, it really helps in the way your children behave and how they relate. And then I always tell my kids, somebody's looking at you. Your ancestors wouldn't want you to be doing this.
That's a little more heavy-handed than my experience. In a certain sense, I was raised in this strange situation where I lived in an all-Italian neighborhood. Beacon Hill, when I was a kid, you were either Japanese or Italian, one or the other. And in my class at St. George's, we started with Chucky Bosey in the first row, and then Anthony Canaro behind him, and then I came along, and all the way around the room to Joe Zavalia, who sat in the same seat for 8 years in a row. Zavalia, right? He was the last kid in the class because the nuns kept us in alphabetical order. So in that environment, I was kind of surprised to learn that not everybody was Italian American. And it all came home for me when I finally went off to Italy for my junior year abroad, Gonzaga University in Florence. And I woke up for the first day in Italy in Venice, and I went out on the streets of Venice, and it dawned on me, well, I know these smells, I know these sounds, I understand this language. And I felt like I'd come home to a home I'd never known I'd left. It was just changed my life. I run an Italian festival now. It was like getting religion. So.
It kind of reminds me of that story, Ramon, you just shared about when your son went to Japan for the first time, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay. I mean, and it kind of highlights why the celebrations are important for people to be able to have that place they go to where they see themselves. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I guess, is there anything, before we open it up for questions, is there anything else you'd want to say about the festivals, their significance, or...
I know there's something Steve wants us to say, because we've had this discussion many times. And let's not forget that one other very important part of these community celebrations is to dispel stereotypes, okay? That's kind of the elephant in the room. In the case of, I'll just start with me, but I'm sure every ethnic group in America has their peculiarities that they're defensive about. Let me just read you one quick thing. Okay, the United States Immigration Commission concluded in the infamous 1911 Dillingham Report, certain kinds of criminality are inherent in the Italian race. In the popular mind, crimes of personal violence, robbery, blackmail, and extortion are peculiar to the people of Italy. This is the United States government, okay? In 1924, they passed the Immigrant Exclusion Act, and the only country they named in the entire world was Italy. They cut the percentage of Italians allowed into America by 90%. So, one of the reasons we put on Italian festivals is to show the other people, those other people, that we're not a bunch of gangsters, okay? And I know, Steve, you have a story about that. I'm sure everybody here does. So there's kind of the other serious side of the coin instead of all of the da-dun-da-dun-da-dun-da-dun-da-dun-da-dun. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because we talk about the dancing and the food and the things that attract people when they attend one of the celebrations at Seattle Center, but it really is about more than that. It's about seeing really who we are, not just the headline of who we are. And, you know, I'll never forget traveling to Haiti when I covered the earthquake, and on my way there I was watching all the news reports showing all of this looting and people, you know, violence and running over each other for food. And so I'm thinking when I get there, okay, I'm really going to have to, this is going to be a scary situation in addition to obviously tragic. And I get there and I see none of that. And it didn't mean that those things didn't happen, but it's just one thing. It's not the whole area. And so, you know, walking down the street and there's a woman frying fish and no one's stealing her fish. And, you know, I just thought that was interesting. So when you know, these celebrations, it really is a gateway to learning more. Yeah, and Juliet, did you want to add anything about how these celebrations tie into dispelling stereotypes?
It's like some people will say, you know, like about the Philippines. The Filipinos are not only about adobo and lumpia. They have more to offer.
Yeah, and really, you know, when you think about, we talked about how these celebrations are good for those, you know, who are having them, obviously, when you go and you're able to see yourself, but it really makes for a better community. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, how would you describe it, Ramon? And in terms of how it makes for a better community when others are invited in to see, how it makes us all better.
Oh, God, it makes the world bigger. It makes your community smaller and tighter.
Oh, your microphone, yeah. It's
I
that
keep
writer
doing
in him.
that.
He's like, can I write this
Yeah,
first?
I could just,
Why
yeah,
don't
I know.
you write it? We'll let Dennis talk.
I wasn't able to write before this question. No, I think it's absolutely vital. Yeah, I think it's a way to humanize. It's fascinating. It's interesting. There's so much to love. I took my son is he's young enough that I can say whatever I want about him in public, but he tends to get a little scared and a little intimidated by things, by the weirdest things. I can't even clock exactly what they're going to be. When he's watching a movie or something, he'll get really freaked out. We went to see taiko. Do you guys know what taiko is? It's a Japanese traditional drumming, and it's fantastic. I mean, you feel it in your bones. It's fantastic. If you ever get a chance to check out taiko, I definitely check it out. And especially street taiko, that's just like the neighborhood kids got together and started to pound stuff. And we watched this really intense taiko session, and the entire time I'm holding him thinking oh, he's gonna bolt or something like that. And this is gonna sound so corny and smarmy, but it just happened. I got to watch him absorb something that was, yeah, he's like, yeah, my ancestors are watching me. Like they are, that's what it is. There they are, you know. It was fantastic to actually watch that transmission of culture occur, because usually I think it's a much more long-term act. So yeah, and that was at a cultural ceremony. So yeah, it's great. I didn't know this one, but my wife, when we were in Japan, said, hey, I really want to take Akio's my son, to go do Ichigo-san, which is when your kid turns 5. They dress him up in this rad yukata, like a kimono, and they give him a sword, and he holds a sword in these pictures, and he's 5, and he's a small 5, because, you know, and it's, so I have pictures of my kid like holding imposingly a samurai sword and like looking at the camera, and it's the greatest thing ever. And I had no idea what it was when we were there. She just said, I want to do this thing, and because I knew it was important to her, I was like, yeah, dude, do it. That's fantastic. But and I have those pictures. If anyone would like me to, if anybody would like to twist my arm, I guess I could share them. But you know, yeah, super important. You got to go.
He's like, that's the part of the culture I like. The shoes, he's like, not so much. No, not yet. Juliet, were you going to add something? I thought I saw you wanting to jump in today.
Yeah. Also, this celebration is like people acknowledge the differences. And also as an individual, sometimes there are people, you know, you think like you're different. You're not really different. We have a similarity too. Like you have something like, you think that you are weird, you know, and then you say, oh, they're doing that too. So I'm not weird at all. Yeah.
There you go, right. Okay, so I think what we're gonna do is open up to questions.
So I'm 25, and one of the things that you guys brought up was this kind of conversation about youth engagement and getting them involved. So I grew up in Seattle and all my life, and traveled a lot, but different story. One of my biggest concerns as a youth trying to engage with culture and community is a lot of resistance at the end of the day with the older generation, or even in the culture itself, or any. As a Seattleite, it's pretty common that every 3 years another culture comes into the city and you engage with it. It's awesome, it's amazing, but at the same time, that's a huge distraction because you have no time to build a foundation in your own culture, your own community. And one of the questions I wanted to bring to you guys is, how do you see that play out for youth? As in, they would love to engage and continue to engage, but there's a lot of problems hindering that. There's so much resistance. There's so much blame.
Where's the resistance coming from?
I mean, personally, I'll go with a classic millennial joke. You know, we're selfish, entitled, and all that kind of stuff. When we're doing our best, we're trying really hard, and as you see tons of examples of millennials engaging and working hard to engage with culture, but it just continues to be smothered out, and that really really makes you want to give up.
When you say it's being smothered out, I guess I'm not. Who is smothering? Who's doing the smothering?
Well, I guess I wouldn't blame anyone specifically, but if you guys are familiar with Seattle in general, I mean, it's pretty easy for the city to push out conversation or find a new conversation to talk about. It's very easy for the city to do it. And I don't want to say that as a problem in the city, but Pacific Northwest in general, it's a very young culture. I mean, we started in like the 1900s practically, just the early 20th century, and that doesn't build a very strong foundation to really breathe. And I work in mental health. One of the conversations we always have is people are able to express an emotion, but until they're able to feel that emotion, then they're never really going to deal with their problem. And I see that as one of my antidote for the situation. We can try to be cultural, but we're never really breathing it in.
Okay. And then, do you remember the question? Do you guys remember? Okay, go ahead.
Well, first of all, come volunteer for me, because believe me, we'll accept you. We are just desperate to get younger people involved, because otherwise the whole point of the exercise is just going to literally die out. What you might have to do, though, rather than showing up one day saying, hey, I'd like to participate in your cultural celebration, and I think you guys ought to do this, 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 and this, is, of course, first gain their trust and their respect by just being a hard worker. And yes, you'll have to listen to a lot of, oh, that's not how we do it, or we've always done it that way. But gradually, you'll be empowered by the fact that we're so anxious to have somebody take the ball and run with it, and then you can make changes.
I think it's also how you communicate between the old and the young. There is always a problem in the Filipino community between even grandparents and their grandchildren. We had I experienced that myself. So I always tell the younger generation, you have to maybe choose the kind of word and your gestures, because older people are very sensitive. That's one thing. And also the way you communicate with each other. Older generation will say, you teach them a little bit, their head becomes big, they think they know everything. They say that too. So I think it's more, more communication. I think it's how you communicate.
Yes, this is not a question. I'd like to comment on race in Seattle. I've been here 30 years, and I live down on South Lake Union right now, and I don't see many people that look like me. So I'm almost challenged to show up just to have a presence. We will never get to the point where there is oneness until we rewire our brains and start to see each other as human beings. Respect your culture, but the bottom line is we're only human beings. Everyone is, each one of us. What more could we be? Bingo.
Well, before I have several comments, but before I ask you guys something, I'd like to read a very short thing. It's a part of a campaign I developed, and it says, the United States has a multicultural face. Knowing the differences among our diverse societies permits us to see what we humans have in common. It embraces real acceptance. This is part of a campaign, and this is the thought of a Canadian writer. But talking about the interest that you guys have to embrace cultural diversity, I am from Colombia, and I see a lot of, I can say, use ignorance in a good way about cultures here, but it's. And I noticed something very important, and it gets kind of related to what he said regarding the Festa or the activities that the Seattle Center does. And is there is a disconnection, I think, that I have observed between people that are older or people that are old and have been living here for a long time, and also first art countries there. There is a disruption between what people that live here show about, for example, Latin America. We are 21 countries. We have, each country has very diverse cultures. Of course, we have some background in common, but sometimes people look at me and said, do you speak Mexican? In Seattle. I'm sure it doesn't happen at the East Coast, but it's fine. We are here to learn from each other. So I really love the purpose that the Seattle Center has, celebrating cultures. And I have been kind of excited always to go. And when I go, I see that there is so a small crowd, and then I say, why this greatness, these marvelous events don't have more assistance? And it is hard in Seattle because especially in summer, everybody is doing different activities. But I think it could be great if we can find a way to take that organizations from groups that have been there, that kind of monopolize, or what he said, kind of resist the new people, the new generation, and also take a little bit more, make a little bigger effort to connect with the cultures in our countries, because there is a big gap between what we have here and what is really the culture there in Philippines or in Japan or in Colombia or in Mexico. There's a huge difference that people don't understand. For example, talking about Mexicans, the Mexicans that live here, they are farmers, that most of them come from very small little villages. So people don't take the time to analyze, and I think it could be a great opportunity for us to learn from other cultures, because that's what it makes this country rich or richer.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
Hello, my name is Peter. Not from Seattle. I came here from Arizona, hoping to get out of Arizona. So one of the reasons why I came to Seattle was I was reading about, in one of my classes when I was doing graduate school at ASU, about Seattle's race and social justice initiative, as well as King County's Office of Equity and Social Justice. And after I graduated from my program in Justice Studies at ASU, I started to read about gentrification issues and displacement of people of color. The other day, I read an article in the Seattle Times about black home ownership has been decreasing for the past 10 years in King County. So a critique I have about cultural festivals is that we don't talk about race and class issues happening within cultures, and we don't talk about white culture. We talk about Italian American, Irish American, British American, but we don't talk about the collective, you and me, you and I, Dennis, white culture, and how we're complicit in gentrification and displacement. So is Festa making Seattle better? Is it really educating white folks in their complicity of racism, liberal whites too? Is it really stopping gentrification? And how can Festa, how can cultural celebrations and events like this better educate whites about their complicity in racist and systemic and institutional oppression?
I want to answer your question. White people, I include them in my program. You know, my ex-husband is white, and yeah, that I always, and actually most of the people who fund me, who donate on my group, are white people, because they're very interested in what I do, and I tell them this is what I do. This is for the younger kids, and then my house is always filled with white people, so I am educating them too, and getting them a part of my project, my program.
And were you, in your question, were you wanting to know more about, I guess, educational programming? Is that was as part of the celebration, or am I off base with that?
I also have a response, but I have yeah, you can go. Okay. I guess I would like to say, in terms of cultural festivals at Seattle Center, is two things. One is the fact that they're at Seattle Center, I think, is part of that, right? It's part of the idea of each of these cultures is not segregating themselves apart from everyone else, and is sharing with the entire community. So I think that that's a large part of that. I think too that there needs to be a certain amount of I want to say trust, but I'm thinking more connection to the different communities before you can have conversations that are have more of a possibility of conflict. And that these cultural festivals, then what they're doing is allowing people to make those connections that make them feel closer to the different communities, so that then at a later time at this table, at a table in some community center, at whatever other places, they can show up and have those conversations from a place of comfort and a place of understanding where these people, where we all come from. I think, so I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not sure that these cultural festivals are the place to have those kinds of conversations. The cultural festivals are the places where you set up the basis to be able to have those conversations later.
Oh, well said.
I just wanted to say briefly that Delbert Richardson participates in Festival Sundiata, and when you mentioned gentrification specifically and how that has impacted the black community, what Delbert does is he has an exhibit. He calls it the American History Exhibit. And it's a collection of artifacts and all sorts of items that kind of tell the story of the African American people in this country. It starts in Africa, it goes through slavery, then it goes through past slavery, it goes to Jim Crow, and then eventually it comes right back to Africa. But in that storytelling with the exhibits, the artifacts, things like slave chains and a Ku Klux Klan uniform, and all of those things, and Delbert's skill at talking about the history of African American people in this country, it tells the great story, and it does, as this woman here has said, which I happen to know, Paula. Paula said it sets a foundation of understanding, because you have to create a historical context to get to gentrification.
We called white Anglo-Saxon Protestants white people. Amongst ourselves, we'd say, well, yeah, we're going to have a dance, and well, yeah, but will the white people come? So we felt, you know, somebody was telling me just the other day, a kid from New York City said he never, an Italian kid, never knew what box to check on the surveys and stuff. He always thought he was an other, because, you know, we look different and we're treated differently. So I guess you're right, but I don't think the festivals are the place to do that. That would have to be some kind of other organization or institution or place.
Okay.
We have two more responses. Do you have a response or do you have a question?
I guess I have a quick response and a question, but my quick response would be, yes, white people need to be the ones telling other white people something's up, because people of color have been saying that for years.
I am pretty new to town, or in my neighborhood, we say that I'm still newish and also Jewish. And I think a piece of that question relates to the young lady's comment about these wonderful festivals with maybe not as much attendance as we would like, and then also the statements about needing to get more young people engaged, which is that there is wonderful but perhaps disproportionate focus on the historical aspects of those cultures. And even, you know, you mentioned the American history, like, what about now? And especially, I used to live in DC, and when we were raising money for the American Indian Museum, we'd have these amazing powwows on the National Mall. And it was all celebrating American Indian culture and not too much educating on what are indigenous issues today, and that's not only interesting, but it's really engaging. And if I can just go for the cycle and touch on the other comment about millennials, like, which I guess I am technically, that's what we want to see. We don't want to just, you know, watching drumming and whatnot is great, but we also want to sign up to volunteer to be part of the Chief Seattle Club or things like that.
Thank you. Okay, so my quick comment is that it's interesting to hear about your experience talking about sort of seeing other white people as white. I am identify as Ashkenazi Jewish and definitely white. And I have a lot of hesitance when I hear older generations emphasizing anti-Semitism and comparing it to racism, because as like a fierce anti-racist activist, I feel like, oh my God, don't compare oppression, like, and racism is real, stop, please don't take up too much space as being Jewish. A lot of internalized anti-Semitism, but it is interesting, I find it generationally, how different groups became white over time, and how like my grandparents, and in different regions too, I think people might be seen differently as white, but I know that my whole life I've been treated as white, and I've had all the privileges of being white, and so even if my ancestors have not, I can't even imagine actually my grandparents not having white privilege. Like I can't imagine that, and maybe that's not what you're saying. You're saying that you're seeing other people as white, and this could open a whole other topic. But I guess it's complex, like culture and how one is treated based on how they're seen versus how the culture they actually are, and it's just there's a lot to talk about, which I feel like there's people who get PhDs on this. Can I ask my question before?
Absolutely, you've been so patient.
On your grandparents, your poor. I don't know where they're from, but the odds are 90%. Oh, sorry. I don't know where they're from, but the odds are 90% they were fleeing the pogroms in Russia, or the ovens of Auschwitz, or some other very harsh, miserable existence to make them come to this country.
I know my grandparents' story pretty well.
Yeah.
I've done some papers on it and talked to them a lot. I still think they were treated as white. I mean, I think that my ancestors definitely have had oppression in the past, and in the U.S. And they were here, and anyway, I'm okay. Question. And I really appreciate everyone sharing and questions, and thank you all, and thank you. I really appreciate your facilitation. So one of the questions you brought up earlier was about like. When you asked, when people have a question about someone, but they don't want to be offensive, so don't ask. I really appreciate that question, and I just wanted to ask what you all might say is the difference between being curious about another culture or someone else and exotifying that culture or person, and how you know inside of you and how you know when you ask, the difference between those two.
Well put question.
Take it away.
I have to think about it. The difference between exotifying someone and being curious about who they are, define exotify.
I'm so glad you said that,
Yeah,
because
I need
I
to
didn't
get
know.
that.
As a journalist, I'm like, oh, there's a word I know. I'm
Yes, I need the
yes,
term,
good,
yeah.
let's do that, yeah.
I would say exotify is like, oh, that person is other, is different. I mean, I feel like it's sort of hard because it's like an intuitive feeling of this is something in a museum that I want to look at and study, but not something I can really relate to and be curious as another human about.
Well, I think when I ask, I want to learn more about that person. You know what I mean? I don't, it's not about them being exotic or not exotic. I just like to be closer to people. I just like the world to feel like a slightly smaller place sometimes. And so a lot of it is just wanting to know who they are. And I think when it's couched in that, then it's just genuine curiosity between souls instead of somebody really kind of like oohing and awing over what they perceive that person to be. That might be a starting point. I don't know that I would start there and then see what anybody else wants to kick, where you guys would want to take that, but I don't know. Can anybody take it deeper?
I guess I'm having trouble with that definition too of exotify. Luigi Barzini in his book The Italians talks about people who go to Italy and then go back and stay longer and go back again until they find they can never leave. These are obviously non-Italians. And in his words, he said, they become more Italian than the Italians. And having lived in Florence for many years, I can't tell you how few Italian friends I have that have ever been to see the David. You know, they live there. Why do we, you know? So if by exotify you mean to fall in love with the culture for the culture's sake, or am I off base here?
You know, go ahead. Oh, I think when you asked the question, one thing that came to mind, I'll never forget, I was at a preschool in Queen Anne, and my daughter was standing in line, and this mom, when she didn't think I was looking, went to touch my daughter's hair. And it was just, I can say that I've been asked about my hair a lot, but I think it's the intention. To your point, it is kind of a feeling, and it's a spirit of like, well, tell me about your hair. I noticed that, you know, one day it's this, and there it's this, and I'd love to know more. It's a genuine curiosity versus, I think, being in wonder. Just, and I think it is more of a feeling, which is probably why it's hard to, at least in my book. So I don't know if that, but when you asked that, I just knew there is a difference in the spirit and the intention of the person, and you know, are they really wanting to know about me versus just, you know, oh, that's weird, or, you know, making judgments about it.
And also it's the, you know, like if I'm not offended when people ask me where I came from or who are you, because I'm obviously, you know, different color. And I think it's the way you feel about, you know, like, whether you're offended or not. Actually, I look at that as an opportunity to tell them who I am and where I came from. And I look at it in a bigger aspect. I'm not offended with it.
Did we come close? Did we answer the question?
Or just...
Time is beginning to run short, so I'm going to ask, I know there's a lot of people, all of a sudden we got about 6 hands that want a response.
Okay,
I'm going to ask to limit to the panelists and then go to this gentleman here for the next question.
Okay. Did you say you wanted to add something?
I want to say one thing about
Mike.
Okay.
If that's possible.
Can you do that now?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have a chance before to respond, but like I am doing this right now, like passing like culture on. I think one thing, we are talking about festivals here exclusively, and obviously festivals are awesome and everybody should go and they're amazing, but like they can also seem monolithic to people who still haven't developed a connection to their own culture. And so I think one thing to do is, particularly with introverts, okay, like, I mean, I think sometimes it can be a question of like, hey, go find something out about your ancestors or your culture that you are in love with. Go find something go find one thing a week that you love about your culture or something like that. Like, go expose yourself to some of these things. I think exposure, I think some people need to develop because it's not a monolithic thing, you know what I mean? It's easier to say that it's this, there is culture, but everybody develops their own specific relationship to their culture, you know? And so I think, I think it's important not to discount that, and that you have to kind of, I think, furnish young people with the tools that they'll need and the interest that they'll need to be able to find that relationship and be able to clarify that relationship and kind of build their own path to their culture, which you're totally allowed to do. And is completely normal, you know? I didn't know it was normal for years, that's why I say that out loud. But anyway, I just wanted to respond to that. I'm sorry it's so late.
I want to tell you something too with the Pagdiriwang Festival and other festival I'm involved with. There are people your age that, because we're open for people to volunteer, so they will all sign up. Let's say there's 10 who will sign up, there's only 1 who will show up.
Do they have a voice, though? I mean, because you guys were talking about, well, you come and you volunteer, you pay your dues, and you do this. And I know that different companies have intentionally decided they're going to cater to the millennials. And so they've restructured their offices. And is there a piece where the festivals maybe need to meet the millennials where they are?
Yeah, they have a voice. Like in my group alone, in my dance group, my cultural group, I'm not the only one choreographing or teaching. It's me and them. It's not all my creation. I give that opportunity for them to be artistic, and to whatever their idea is, I give it to them. It's not like, okay, I'll just show them like this thing is all about this thing. And then the rest, what do you want to contribute? And then it make it easier for me too. Because if I'm traveling somewhere, I'm not there, they can take care of themselves.
All right, I think we have more questions, right? Okay. Or
Okay, new question.
okay.
I'm just thinking about, there are people who are neither black or white, and there's people who are more mixed. These cultural festivals, they seem very, very singular for maybe my kids who are in their 5th generation. They don't have to pick one culture. Where does the festival come in to highlight that they can choose multiple? Because, yeah, if you take some of the people who are in America, we might come from 6 different countries. And so how do we develop inclusion with all these distinct festivals in a better way?
Actually, the challenge is the inverse of that. My challenge is, our challenge is the inverse of your proposal, and that is, since especially with the older immigrant communities that have been here for 5 generations, the Irish have been here for 10. The hard part is getting their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, et cetera, who are of such mixed heritage, interested at all in any of them, because they're diffused. They don't feel Greek American or whatever. So I think if they were to, if I could say anything, I'd say, well, pick one or try them all and see if there's parts of it that you like. That's Ramon's point. And then if there are, we'll encourage that.
I wanted to speak to something that Juliet had said about teaching of culture beginning at home and how important that is. And while I agree with that, as we all know, black people didn't come here of their own accord. And our culture was stripped away. And so most of us have absolutely no idea where we came from or what our roots are. And so in order to be able to do that, it's extreme challenge. What is it that I give my son in terms of his heritage? Because I don't know what that is. And so we struggle a lot with that because we're trying to give them some sense of who we are, but who we are started here for most of us. It didn't start where we came from. And so it's very different for the majority of black people in this country.
That's a very good point, yeah. You had a quick response?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Dennis was bringing up. I think that's where there's a difference in identity with different American groups. For me, as someone who's a person of color, I felt forced to pick one or the other, versus if someone who is a different kind of American, maybe they didn't feel like they had to pick one, but I think there's something different there. Yeah, you're right, like, yeah, I don't have to be Greek, I don't have to be Irish, maybe I'm just white. Versus, yeah, I'm Chinese, white, Latino, and Filipino. Like, I have to pick the one that's the least complex for someone to understand. Yeah. I'm just showing that as an example. I'm contrasting. I'm contrasting against Dennis. Yeah.
It's not necessarily a thing you just do, right? Because then there's context, right? In different contexts, like you have to take, like your identity kind of swirls around several different kind of identifications, right? Yeah, it's so true. For me, it's largely contextual, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but you identify with what he's talking about in terms of feeling pressured to choose one?
100% every time you take a standardized test. Are you kidding me? You're like, what do I do? Can I? And you're just like, to only choose one? Like, what are you talking about? Yeah, absolutely. Like that alone. Like there's a million microcosmic examples of it every day. Yeah, it's true. You know what's funny too is like, I speak Japanese way better than I speak Spanish, and it trips Japanese people out. Like it's crazy because I'm half Japanese, but like there isn't a Japanese person alive who looks at me and goes, oh my God, it's my brother. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's not gonna happen, you know? Except for my sister. But yeah, anyway, so that's gone right up the flagpole. I think that's great.
Come on, serious. What do you have to check?
It's getting better now. Now you can check too. Oh. Yeah, it was. Yeah, now oftentimes you can check too. Yeah.
Awesome. It used to blow up the Scantron. All right, we have a question in the back.
My background is in anthropology, and discussing exoticness is a big deal there. So there's a lot of discussion in anthropology about how people perceive other groups. And one of the things that's been said about Europeans, about powerful Europeans for generations, has been seeing other people not really as fully human, as being sort of museum pieces. All Native Americans wear feathers, and they live in wigwams, and I can go to their reservation and buy their stuff and touch their things, and I can wear feathers and dance in a powwow too, and I'll be just like them. Or I can touch your hair, and that's okay, because I'm white. There's all this stuff that that as part of white culture, these other cultures are museum pieces, because we're the future, we're the normal thing. And so the woman here who was talking about how deep down we can see other people as exotic, not really as multifaceted as we are, as part of these monoliths. Like you were saying, all Italians like garlic, all Italians do this. And then we come to people like Ramon who are like, well, you have to be in one box. You can't pick multiple boxes. That would make the world crazy. And I'm joking, because I think it's, as a former student of anthropology, I love how diverse this planet is. And I love these festivals because they do show us how diverse they are. It's unfortunate we can't talk about politics, because that's important, especially these days. But I can see the Seattle Center. So is there some forum where we can start to address why certain Irish people do not like other Irish people, and why that goes back for generations? Thank you.
I don't think you need I agree with everything you said. I don't have a follow-up answer to that, because I agree with everything you just said. And as far as creating another forum, that's possible, but again, someone would have to organize that.
Yeah, Steve is over here. Steve is his thinking cap's on. He's like, okay, how can we further this? Because it's come up a couple of times in this discussion. All right, do we have any other questions?
We have to take the last one or two.
Okay, so we'll say two more.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I have a comment and question. So both my parents are from Colombia, but I grew up here. And I didn't really I never had an issue with accepting that I was Hispanic, but I didn't really fully realize I was Hispanic till I was older, or found pride in that. I was like, I don't really like rock music, but everyone around me sort of likes it, so I guess I'll try. But yeah, so I've lived in Seattle for a bit, but in the last 2 years I've been in LA, which was difficult to get used to. But then I was like, oh my God, this is like the world. Like LA has everyone, and I was so I had to move back up here for financial reasons, but I was so scared to come back to Seattle because of what I found in LA. And the people I was able to expose myself to. And you're talking about exposure, and that's huge. I mean, like everybody, no one would say I'm a racist, even though we all have those tendencies, because we're part of a culture that, unless we observe ourselves, we can't step away from, And so when I was in LA, I found a workshop that was held by Reverend Lawson, which he's been doing for 20 years. It's a nonviolence workshop. And that was a privilege to be there, to be able to, it was like every single type of person that I could, and I get to hear their answers to political questions, and it was amazing because he would start off some controversial stuff, bringing up a controversial subject, and then when I want to talk to other people, I want to hear other people's opinions. I want to know how they experience life. I'm so curious, deeply curious about that. And that space was a really safe place, especially because Reverend Lawson is a master at keeping things calm. So even if someone was really heated about something, we're here to talk, we're here to discuss, we're here to learn about each other's experience. And that's what I am looking for here, and that's my question. And I was already okay, I'm gonna start fundraising to bring Reverend Lawson up here and start some workshops here, because Because, well, yeah, no, I'm just curious because I've been here for like 4 days, and I've just been like deeply trying to find these things. That's why I'm here right now. And my question is like, does anything like that exist right now? Where it's, he literally held it once a month in a Methodist church, all different types of backgrounds. And it was about a 4-hour workshop. And it would have like 40 to 50 people there, completely free. And it's so powerful. And if it doesn't exist right now, I'd love to like make that happen with people. Yeah.
The gentleman in the blue shirt, you guys should exchange digits and.
And then Steve too. Steve is very welcome. Do you know Steve?
I don't know Steve.
Yeah,
I'm
Steve,
Gabriella.
you should connect.
I would say come see us at Seattle Center and let's talk about bringing Reverend Lawson.
Great. Sounds good.
Yeah, there you go. That was easy. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, we have time for one more. Didn't we have another? Yes.
More of just a comment, but to kind of maybe tie up a few of these key points. A little closer, sorry. Same problem. I like to boom my voice instead of actually use a mic. Thank you, Angela and Davida, Steve, everyone, panelists, for this, because I think part of bridging the gap both within the disparity that we see, both within age generationally, within this significance of understanding the great nuance of identity, even within an individualized culture, let alone when you begin to mix culture or racial genetics, or then whenever you put all of that together in one city, it becomes even more nuanced. What bridges that is a conversation, I think, like this, or building more of these, allowing more of these to happen. And so bringing that then back to what is celebratory about Festa and these kind of events, I'm a dance educator, and I have 2 students in particular, both mixed race, who are young, under 18, and within the past couple of weeks, I myself have ran into them at Festival Sundiata, at Balkan Night. And so it's young people who would get lumped into this category of seeming disinterest or having nothing to do with their culture, both from multiple cultures. And they themselves then don't have an area of expression for that, because there is sometimes a sense of we're pushing for a broader awareness of our role in the world. So we are not a limited singular culture or a limited singular identity. There's no other place for us who don't feel singular. And it feels like when you have these large amalgams of groups together, there's then this ability, if it's not intrinsically broadcast in it, there is this ability for those who want to be like-minded, for those who want to investigate these cross connections, suddenly now have their own new culture, this non-systematic, interconnected culture. But if there weren't these sort of petri dishes of availability to see what our scope in the world was, they wouldn't have had that at all. And I think a lot of the conversations and questions that we brought up are much more nuanced and complex, but it is because of having forums like this that you even then have the capability to broach them, or at least to do so in a way that you gather enough education and resources to take away the ignorance and actually find pathways then to solutions and connectedness. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
That was a lovely summation.
I know. I feel like we can just get out of here now. Thank you guys so much for coming and for asking good questions and making some really excellent points. And let's give our panelists a round of applause. Ramon, Dennis, Juliet, thank you.